All right. Good morning to everyone and all our visitors that are joining us today. My name is Jose Martinez. I do education here at the Mexican Art Museum. And with me today is our curator and director of programs, Dr. George Vargas, associate professor at the University of Texas, Dr. Sara Lopez. And I'm gonna give the floor to Dr. Vargas to introduce her. Dr. Vargas.
Bienvenidos, welcome. My name is Dr. George Vargas, curator and director of programs at Mexican Art Museum in Austin, Texas. Today, we present the fourth lecture in the virtual lecture series dedicated to life and experiences in the US-Mexico borderlands, which examines the cultural history and social issues as expressed by artists living in the El Paso, Juarez, and the US-Mexico borderlands. In 2019, Mr. Juan Antonio Sandoval Jr. donated his wonderful collection of art and books to the museum. The current exhibition, Mexico, the Border and Beyond, features selections from the Juan Sandoval collection and is on view until August 22nd. A large part of the exhibition is life and experiences in the US-Mexico borderlands, which is divided into 5 themes. 5 scholars each will examine a theme. Before we continue, the museum wants to thank our sponsors and especially the National Endowment for the Humanities for the generous support of this program. We also invite our viewers to submit questions and make comments, which will be answered by our lecturer upon completion of our presentation. Without further ado, the museum proudly presents Dr. Sara Lopez, who will speak on Immigrant Dream and Nightmare, Mexican Mobility in Perspective, Building Futures, Closing Pathways. Dr. Lopez is a built environment historian and migration scholar, and an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Her book, The Remittance Landscape, The Spaces of Migration in Rural Mexico and Urban USA, won the 2017 Spiral Castoff Book Award from the Society of Architectural Historians. Lopez was a Princeton Mellon Fellow in 2016 to 2017, and is a faculty affiliate with American Studies, the Amos Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice, the Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies, and the Center for Mexican American Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Dr. Sara Lopez.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very honored to present my work in conversation with the collection that you currently have on view. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so I wanted to start today by situating the particular perspective that I hope to bring to the discussion of Mexican mobility. It is a perspective that is generated by research on architecture, on the built environment, on landscapes. It is a perspective on how architecture plays an absolutely vital role, but often overlooked role in shaping migrants' futures, past, and present. So as Dr. Vargas noted, I am trained as an architectural historian, but over the years, I have developed several research projects born from the relationship between architecture and US-Mexico migration. And I'm going to talk about 2 of the projects I've developed over the years today. The subject of the first part of my talk, Building Futures, started way back in 2003 and 4 when I was a master's student at UC Berkeley. I worked in a kitchen with men from Guanajuato, Mexico at the time. And over the years, we began discussing their home building projects in Guanajuato. My naive assumptions back then were that they were living and working in the US with the intention of investing their earnings primarily in Berkeley, where we worked. So for my master's thesis years ago, I went to their familial compound in Ramillete, and I documented the built environment change due to decades of remitting. And what you're looking at here is an image of the 8 houses that the brothers were able to build, a house for each of them, with the money they were earning in the United States. And what you're also looking at is a little map of Ramillete that I did years ago, showing you where people were in the United States, Georgia, Colorado, Texas, onto the street where that money was coming to in Ramillete, in that village in Mexico. So you can kind of see, you can start to think about migration networks in this image. From this seed, my larger research agenda emerged, and I began to ask about remitting in general. How does remitting, which is just an economic term, which really just means a transaction of capital from one place to another, sending capital, sending money. How does remitting as a strategy to build new places fundamentally change both the place produced, fundamentally transform both the place produced and the subjectivities of the producers? How did sending money change the lives of the people who were sending the money? I was also asking how remittance architecture, first of all, what is remittance architecture? And then how did it reposition the migrant in both Mexican and US society? Often remittances are visualized more like this, like flows embedded in narratives about how remitting is a global strategy that's on the rise. Mexico is amongst the top 4 largest receivers of remittances in the world, alongside China, India, and the Philippines. And the US-Mexico migration corridor is one of the largest in the world, sending some $35 billion to Mexico in 2018. That was an estimate I just saw recently, which is quite higher than it was in 2015, for example. Number keeps going up. But as an architectural historian, rather than flowcharts, I seek to understand the buildings and construction industries remittances produce. So allegedly, a small amount of the money sent to Mexico is spent on buildings. A lot of it is spent on food and medicine and immediate needs. But this investment in new construction is very dramatic in terms of the way that it affects people's lives in Mexico and affects the lives of people who are sending the money. In addition to looking at buildings in Mexico, I also do, oral history and ethnography. So I talk to people and I try to understand their stories. So for this part of my talk, for Building Futures, I want to introduce the remittance landscape in Mexico, which for many is the goal of migration and crossing the border, and which for many holds very symbolic and personal meaning. Although in my work, I focus on remittance landscapes that are produced, 30 to 40 years ago, this map made by Manuel Gamio, the one on the left, and his research team in the 1920s reminds us that remitting has a much longer history. And what the map is here is it says geographical distribution of Mexican individuals who received mail drafts. So each dot represents 10 individuals or less. And the idea here is that in 1926, the people who were receiving mail that was one way to measure money, because the mail was often stuffed with dollar bills, especially if it was international mail coming from the US. And that was one way that Manuel Gamio tried to track where money was going to in this period. And what's fascinating is that when I had a map drawn almost 100 years later of where remittances are going to in Mexico, you can see that concentration of dots in the central high states there in Jalisco, in Nayarit, in Guanajuato, is still a concentration of dots almost 100 years later. which helps us think about the lasting effects of historical practices and processes. Also, in a series of migrant portraits taken by Gamio in Michoacan, Mexico, you see repatriated migrants posing in their US Sunday best, clothes they acquired in the United States, in front of a Model T Ford, also acquired in the United States. The same car here is used in all of the portraits, and it's sort of providing a symbol of American modernity, if you will, right, in these portraits. Another thing that Gamio recorded, which is very interesting for us to think about in terms of this early period of the 1920s, is that 1 out of every 3 migrants in his study brought a car back with him or her to Mexico. The possession of automobiles is absolutely unheard of in the humble social classes to which immigrants generally belong. Many sections of rural Mexico where repatriated immigrant goes to colonize have no suitable automobile roads. And either there is no gasoline or else it is expensive or hard to get, with the result that automobiles are often useless. The good that results is that the possession of automobiles stimulates the owners to build roads, however poor these might be due to the humble circumstances of the owners. It would have been better if they had brought more buggies and carriages. So he's saying here that they're bringing these cars, but they don't have the infrastructure or the stage set to drive and use the cars the way that they may have experienced in the United States. Now, the extent to which repatriated migrants actually built new roads in Mexico is unknown. But we can see that this new car, the modern amenity, caused migrants to perceive that something was wrong in their built environment, a deficiency in their built environment that they attempted to correct through this kind of collective action, through working together. So roads are one of the earliest pieces of evidence of this kind of remittance landscape that I'm talking about, landscape change in Mexico because of migration to the US. I think roads are probably one of the earliest examples that we have of that. Fewer than 1/3 of imported vehicles were trucks suited to rough roads and heavy work, and over 2/3 were passenger cars. And this is the last Gamio image I'm going to show you. This is just a record of all of the objects that Mexican individuals carried back with them across the ports of entry from the United States going back into Mexico. And so you can see interesting things, like tools over here, mowers, shovels. But of course, I'm showing you this because of the car section over here, where it even shows you the make of Dodge, Ford, Pontiac. And this is an image also taken, as you see here. This is data collected from 1926. Indeed, in the current exhibit at the museum that is being woven into this lecture series, we see the way that cars, almost 100 years later, are embedded in representations of very divergent aspects of both Mexican and American life. In Maria Natividad's piece entitled 1936 Ford, the car conjures personal memories of both her grandfather and father who had classic cars. Painting the car against a blue sky on a, quote, never-ending highway is one way for Natividad to connect to her, quote, Chicano culture. And I took those, the quotes are from the captions. Indeed, it is the same make, the Ford, as the cars that are so famously depicted in the Gamio portraits. In Luis Jimenez's painting, American Dream from 1972, the car is meant as a symbol of, quote, material wealth and privilege in American society, end quote. And while the caption reads that, quote, the woman lies in an embrace, end quote, with the car, and the artist, it's described, is referencing both Greek and Olmec mythology, where women are seduced by animals. Here in this painting, it is unclear to me if this is an embrace or a more violent exchange, or even a tragic end to her life. Is the American dream here born or is it killed? As noted, the car is a symbol of wealth and privilege, and quote, Americans are obsessed with their cars, end quote. But as also noted in the previous painting and in some of the images I was showing, the car is also very much a central trope in Chicano and Latinx art, and Mexicans are also obsessed with their cars. So through remittances, we can understand that acquiring a car has been one of the goals of migration since the 1920s, and it really does hold this outsized sort of symbolic importance. The other material goal of migration is the house. Alongside Manuel Gamio, economist Paul Taylor also studied Jalisco, Mexico in the 1920s and 30s. And he notes that some migrants were interested in building a home in the quote, American style. But this desire was quickly set aside by the logistical and practical difficulties of doing so back then in the 1920s. In Arandas, Jalisco, which is where he did his research, Taylor records a returned migrant's musings regarding a new home. Quote, I would like to have a house in American style, but we build thick so no bullet can come through, and no windows. So when the door is shut, no one can come in, end quote. So my study retraced the steps of Paul Taylor and Manuel Gamio, and I recorded a different story. And I'm going to just share with you now some images of more contemporary remittance houses. But to start, I want to talk to you a little bit about what a vernacular house form in rural Mexico looks like typically. A lot of the places that I studied in Jalisco, and I've been to maybe 5 or 6 other Mexican states looking at this phenomena as well, were small towns and villages. And a lot of them had a kind of vernacular made of adobe brick. So just, baked earth mixed with grasses and sometimes excrement. And as you'll note here, if you can see my cursor, the houses are all attached to one another. So they're not separate freestanding homes. There's no sidewalk and they abut the street immediately. There's also basically a shared roof line, and it's usually teja roof or that Spanish tiled roof, baked clay, that makes up that roof line. And the houses generally are 1 story. Many of the houses have that form because they are a courtyard architecture. So behind these long facades, what you have is productive yards. So here, this corner right here is this image you're seeing on the left right here, this fired brick corner in the shadow. And behind that corner, you can see the trees poking out from the back. And those are fruit-bearing trees. And you can see here in my plan that there is a wood fire oven, a productive oven in the yard. And you can see here the corrals for animals and the way then that the architecture just sort of the buildings wrap around, right? So that's a very typical layout for a courtyard house, a corner courtyard house in a town that I was doing this sort of research. In another town in Jalisco that has the name Magic Pueblo or Pueblo Mágico, that name is partially derived because the architecture is so homogeneous. And you can see it's that idea of kind of, having a kind of cultural cohesion and having architecture that has this whitewashed walls that continue along the street for blocks and blocks. Again, with the tiled roof in a quote traditional style, with wrought iron. You can see a tiny kind of wrought iron that's used here and used on the windows and used on the doors, and vigas or wooden beams used above, on the tops of the roofs and as lintels above the doorways. The migrant architecture, if we call it that, has a completely different agenda. It is very much interested in distinguishing itself, being an architecture of difference, being an architecture of experimentation and exploration. And it is very much about expressing different cultural ideas and experiences that migrants have in the borderlands in the United States, in Texas, in whatever city they find themselves. This is a town, Tepatitlan, Jalisco, It's kind of a small city, if you will. And this onion dome facade you see here with the two gold garage doors was designed by an architect. And the architect told me that the client literally just told him, design me a house that will stand out. Not design me a house with an onion dome, but design me something that will make a grand statement. And so the architect came up with the design of the onion dome, which has a slightly kind of Russian, Eastern European, Byzantine. There's different architectural references we might trace, but the point is, it stands out. But even architecture, that is distinguishing itself in different ways has stories to tell. So here we're seeing the use of ornamentation on the left with this kind of suggestion of a gable roof, right? In the United States, we have pitched roofs. That's what we have here, is mostly pitched roofs. In Mexico, there are not pitched roofs with the gable facing to the road. So here you have an ornamentation of a gable roof, or you have the introduction of, remember how I showed you the image where the house is right up against the street and there's no sidewalk? Here you have a sidewalk and you have the house pushed back so that there's a setback between the front of the house and a front garden, if you will. Behind these yellow roses is a picture window. Picture window is another feature of US suburban style homes. And also notice the prominence of the garage doors. I mean, the garage door on the image on the right is literally probably the most expensive piece of that facade, right? With full mirrored ornamentation. So again, thinking of experimentation and making statements. Here, it's just simple color used in these bright stripes that distinguishes the home and, of course, the gable roof. Very prominently, here we have, facing the street. The garage door is important because, remember, I situated the importance of the car. So, of course, 100 years later, designing and building automatic garage doors would be something that would be a priority. So people have spent quite a bit of money doing that. And I will just say that while my research is in Jalisco, Daniel Arredondo has done really great work on how house forms have changed in the Borderlands region, which also I think could be an interesting link we could talk about if anyone had questions later. And then the other last thing I'll point out about this image is the image of a roof. This is just, a tiny little parapet. So you get the idea of this sort of experimentation that I'm talking about, sometimes mixed with classical Mexican elements. So for example, here, a balustrade being made out of stone that is from Mexico and from that region, but again, mixed with some other ideas of architectural innovation. It's interesting to talk to people who own these homes and to ask them why they designed them the way they did, or what they mean for them, or how they intend to use them in the future. And this is a man who migrated to Chicago now it's been probably about 40 years ago, but he lived in Chicago for about 30 years. And incrementally over time, he sent money home and he built this home in Jalisco. And I went to go see it with his brother. So this man over here is his brother. And so his brother and I arrived, and his brother explained what I was doing in my project. And the man said, my house is 100% Mexican. It really, I was not influenced by Chicago, and I was not influenced by architecture in the United States. And then his brother said, what? That's not true. Of course you were. Look how you built the kitchen, with this open kitchen with a countertop where you can see into the kitchen, and then the dining room. It's this open floor plan. We don't have open floor plans. Our kitchens are separate rooms from our dining rooms. And you installed an air conditioning unit that you brought from Chicago. And who here leaves bricks unpainted? You left your bricks unpainted and you varnished them. Nobody does that here. And then the brother was like, I guess you're right. So it was in the conversation that they had that their own understandings of what was motivating them were kind of coming into shape and into full realization. And this is one other interesting story, because this was a family who had a lot of relatives in the United States, but they themselves were not leaving. They were not migrating to the US. And this young girl, excuse me, wanted to have wood floors. She asked her parents, maybe she had seen them in a sitcom or TV show, or I don't know where she got the idea, but she wanted to have wood floors in her house. And so what happened is, this is before Home Depot moved to Guadalajara, which Guadalajara now has Home Depot. And so the family that was in California went to Home Depot, bought wood flooring, rolled it up, and drove it to Jalisco, over 1,500 miles. And they put it down in their house. And again, just thinking about, how do we understand the symbolic importance of these places? And partly it is through collecting the stories of what they mean to individuals and to families and to different people of different ages. This might have been a way for that little girl to feel more connected with her family who was at a distance. So we might ask, what is, all of this architectural evidence of? What does migration do to social and cultural identities, to pride and cohesion? So I wanted to turn to another painting that's in the collection, a painting by Francisco Delgado called Anthropophagia. It's a Brazilian term, radio flyer, from 2014. So here you see the artist painting a visual metaphor for his life in El Paso, inspired by the Brazilian poet Andrande's 1928 manifesto. And he's here reacting to the argument that colonized countries should ingest the culture of the colonizer and digest it in its own way. Delgado says this is, quote, cultural cannibalism, whereby Chicanos, quote, ingest American culture and make it their own. So I'm going to refer now again to Paul Taylor, who I was telling you about, who wrote in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. 100 years ago, Taylor recorded the voice of a leading merchant in Mexico, in Arandas, in a small town, and he said, quote, "Every Mexican who goes, he likes the United States better than Mexico. He gets a better life there than here. After 100 years, it will be goodbye to Mexico. I am afraid they will like America better than Mexico, and we are making wars so they won't become Americanized. They will not like the Mexican flag, and they will have no love of country, and that's a great danger to Mexico." So, end quote. So here, another vision, here meaning in this painting, another vision than that merchant's alarm is offered. Not a binary where one way of life must be chosen over the other, and usually chosen in relation to a kind of asymmetrical power dynamic, right? So the idea is that the US's glitz and glamour is always going to be chosen. But here you see an ingestion where colliding ways of life morph into something new. And there's a sort of empowerment in this image. Yet I also see this image and it sort of makes my bones hurt. There is an empowerment in ingesting and in transformation. But what I also see in this image is that there is a deformation. The process of transformation here is illustrated as so much work. The man's very body is remade. So I think for me, it just poses a question of, can people simultaneously experience both empowerment and a sort of loss? And I wanted to show this image because it does help me think through some of the implications of remittance houses and remittance building. I think in many ways, remittance building is about actualizing one's dream and about building for that better future. But remittance building is also about then living the consequences of that choice to build a remittance house. And so what you see here is an image of a wife pictured in her home in Guanajuato, Mexico, who's living in a remittance house while her son and her husband are living in Oakland, California, working at a meat shop. and that, sending money home. She also has 4 daughters that are not in this image that are living with her. So the family is split along gendered lines, and they are living out their lives like that. So it's this question of at what cost do certain kinds of empowerments come with? And this is the last image I'll show for this part of the talk. This is a image of a house that was a very fancy house. And you see here the plastic draped over the dining room table because the owners didn't live here for much of the year. And there was a young boy who came with his father. His father was an electrician who took care of the house. And he came with his dad and he said, "Dad, why can't we have a house like this?" And his dad sat there and thought, oh my gosh, how do I explain to my child that I would have to risk my life at the border? I would have to leave him and his mother to have a job that would be very difficult, to live in very scary circumstances as an irregular or undocumented person. And even with all those sacrifices, we wouldn't be able to build a house like this, right? Even so. Okay, I am now going to turn to the second part of my talk, and I am being mindful of time, and I see that I'm going to try to keep this next part to about 10, 15 minutes. While my research on the remittance house and the remittance landscape is about aspirational architecture intended to ignite this kind of social change and these better futures or secure futures, I've also researched the way that architecture, particularly immigrant detention centers, can close down futures and curtail dreams. Turning the act of mobility or the fact of living as an undocumented migrant into a nightmare. With my remaining time, I'm going to illustrate how the architecture of detention has reshaped migrant experiences in Texas since the 1960s. And so here you're just seeing that image of the remittance house as aspirational next to that image of the migrant detention center as a sort of closing down of futures. So first, let us turn to one of the earliest detention centers in the United States, Ellis Island, built in 1892, where architectural record notes what a great thing it is, not only for America, but for humanity, that there should be so vast an asylum, or rather arena, open for the crowded out, the residuum of other lands. And then skipping ahead, it is an aesthetic requirement that this lavish hospitality and worldwide welcome should be expressed and expressed in the architecture. So this quote is saying, it's important that hospitality and welcoming basically migrants is expressed in a beautiful building, right? That's what the quote is saying. While I'm not going to go into the ways that Ellis, as one of our earliest detention facilities, failed to provide a lavish hospitality, it's important to note that the earliest detention facilities have been symbolic places. And also, technically, they have functioned as places to quarantine individuals that are awaiting a legal process. That's their technical definition. They're waiting to see if they're going to be imprisoned, deported, or released. They're administrative processing centers. And that's been the case since the Geary Act of 1892, which established detention and deportation in the context of rising Chinese migration to the US. The Geary Act was an extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it forced Chinese laborers to carry internal resident permits. So if you weren't carrying a permit, then it could lead to detention or deportation. And it's very interesting for us to note that the first quote on the top is from the 1890s. Deportation is not a punishment for a crime, and detention is not imprisonment in a legal sense. That was a Supreme Court verdict of the 1890s. And then in 2009, an ICE employee, a Dr. Shriro, who was one of the persons tasked with auditing ICE, wrote, immigration proceedings and civil proceedings and immigrant detention is not punishment. So again, that definition still held technically all those years later. Yet, of course, we have a strikingly punitive infrastructure of detention. And so that raises the questions, can buildings themselves define the nature of punishment? And what work is detention doing? Texas is, or at least it was until recently, the place that incarcerates more non-citizens than any other state in the Union. Here you see the extent to which the entire state is a stage ground for immobilization. Throughout most of the 20th century, Texas did not have all of those dots. In the 1970s, the state had 3 publicly owned and operated facilities. I'm sure you can guess where they were: El Paso, Port Isabel, Laredo. Just to give you a sense of them briefly, the El Paso Detention Center was built in 1960. It was replacing an older detention center that had been in El Paso since at least the 1930s. And you see here, U.S. detention facilities almost like an army camp. And this is a quote from the INS director. The camp was built as inconspicuous as it could be. The absence of watchtowers and strict confinement measures are designed to make life easier to the deportee while in facility. The people detained here are not violent criminals. They're merely charged with being illegally in the US, and they're awaiting investigation before being returned to Mexico or whatever country they're from. We have a couple of interesting images of the El Paso facility. This is the mess hall. So you can see it's in a dining hall. And here you see another part of the dining hall and sitting area. And note, the men are wearing different shoes, and it's all men. Oh, and also note the windows. And here you see on the top a dormitory. 192 men slept in those dormitories. Those are bunks, and note the windows. And then you see the wash basin. So there's a separate room for washing and brushing your teeth, and a separate lavatory with toilets. I'll come back to those images. So that's why I wanted you to sort of keep them in your mind. The Port Isabel Service Processing Center was built in 1961, so very similar, on an abandoned naval base about 30 miles northeast of Brownsville. And at the time, the Attorney General said, the border situation is combined at Port Isabel as in no other place. Here, drug smuggling and human migrants could be intercepted and repatriations performed. And there were about 400 to 600 people that could be detained at Port Isabel on a daily basis. And again, we have some interesting images. We have a very simple dining hall. And then this is the last image I think I have of this one, but I wanted to show you that this is the outdoor recreation area. So you can see that they have a kind of shed roof for shade, and then there's tables underneath where people are. But still, as you can see in this background here, these facilities are surrounded by 12-foot fences topped with concertina wire. And so, the question to which this is a welcoming environment in the 1960s is obviously something that was being debated at the time. Despite the newspaper headline of fine treatment, these debates, and activism against not just the detaining of migrants in this period increasing, but also the treatment of migrants and Mexicans and Chicanos, especially in relationship to labor laws and labor rights, was increasing as well. So it's no surprise that Chicano activism was galvanized in this period in the 1980s to fight against a myriad of injustices. And this is another image from the collection that I wanted to share. It's a 1983 political art calendar by Montoya. And the imagery here of prisons underscores, the message of having nothing left to lose, only our misery. So I thought it was fascinating, the symbolic use of the bars that you see over the faces in relation to this, specific history of Texas's detention. Now, unfortunately, since the 1980s, things have gotten much worse. There are lots of economic and political reasons for this. So what you're looking at here is a graph where you have different pieces of information on the left. So the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, which increases the number of persons that are eligible for detention. You know, you have post 9/11 legislation, which changes funding streams and changes INS. INS turns into ICE. And you have the very beginning also in 2004 forward of what is called the Appropriations Act, which are these amounts of money that go to funding detention beds. And you see that those numbers increase. What's interesting to note is that from 2004 on is also when private prison corporations begin lobbying Congress, and they begin spending upwards of millions of dollars specifically regarding immigration issues. So this image here is showing you that these are the footprints of the detention centers that were built alongside these political and economic changes, and you can see the bed capacity rising as we move toward the present. While in general, immigration scholars and activists have spent time analyzing policies and politics, the reason I drew this graph is because we have to reflect on the fact that buildings, architecture, outlast current administration, and building contracts and building industries shape immigrant enforcement and detention practices on the ground for years to come. So the policy might change, but once you build something, what does that mean for how it actually affects shaping that policy's capacity to change or be undone or redone, right? What's the kind of inertia of the built environment here? It's also important to highlight the key role private prison corporations have assumed in designing detention space. Only 15% of the US prison system is run privately, and it's estimated that currently over 80% of the immigrant detention system is run 15% is run privately, but in the immigrant detention system, over 80% is run privately. And there are lots of reasons why, but in interest in time, I'm gonna kind of skip ahead. I couldn't get much information from the private prison corporations about their design ideas, but I did look to the American Institute of Architects Journal on Justice Facilities to get a sense of what they were saying about prison design in the 1990s and early 2000s. They talked about the jury of this journal, which was made up of an officer, a architect, and a third person that I'm forgetting if it was a judge, I believe. They talked about the increasing non-normative environments of prisons, and they also referred to the hardening of facilities. And so I'm just going to show you a few images of those descriptors. This is the new recreation area. So remember when I showed you Port Isabel and I said there's the yard and there's the shed fence and the men are outside. Now when men go outside, this is an all-male facility. It's actually, they're still inside. So this is considered the recreation area, which is basically like a little pod that's attached to their sleeping area with, you know, the fence on top. The hardening of facilities partially refers to the use of fluorescent lighting. So windows are no longer a part of detention design. Remember I pointed out all the windows, and you have the concrete flooring and crude signage. And also something like this indirect supervision concept, which is to not have overlapping circulation spaces in detention centers, which means that, you know, the people working there won't cross paths with the detainees. The detainees will have more of an experience of isolation. So the jurors wrote, feelings were that once a facility is toughened, there may be no book going back. It's difficult to rescind philosophical and architectural decisions. The behavior of those confined and the response of those who operated these facilities will be directly influenced by the built environment. They were worried about these trends back in the 90s. Now let's just quickly see what ICE thinks about design. ICE has specifications of where the desk should go and the chairs and the size of the windows and the size of the rooms for people like officers in charge. But when we get to the part of the manual that talks about detainee housing, it is contractor space detailed. And ICE abdicates that responsibility to the private prison corporations. They do not spec out or design how migrants experience detention. This is just an image showing you of all the different footprints of detention centers here in Texas, and they are along the general prison typologies of telephone pole, campus barracks, campus sprawl, sort of prison types. And I'm going to end with one story. It's a story of Miguel, and he was at Paso, where he spent 4 months there after his journey. He was detained because he crossed the border without papers, but he was an asylum seeker from Panama, actually. And he was a musician who was facing extortion in Panama, which is why he left. And you can see here in this drawing that he did of his journey from Panama, that he had a run-in with the Zetas, which is a gang that is a very scary experience that he relayed to me in Nuevo Laredo. And then you can see that he then crossed the border. Many asylum seekers go to find patrol officers. So they sort of, at this period, they would purposefully turn themselves in, quote unquote, to start the asylum process and find themselves then in detention. And you can see his depiction of Pearsall. And then he also drew for me the pod. And you can see here that there's beds, there's long tables here where they ate, and they had here their bathroom, and they had their rec space. And so the reason I wanted to show you this is because all those rooms that were different images in the 1960s facilities have now been combined into one pod where 100 men spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week together under surveillance. So I have more to say about this image and more to say about this topic, but in the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip my second example. And I'm just going to end with, the kind of call for thinking about the ways that architecture shape migrants' lives, moving across the border to a place in the United States is very much about aspirations and igniting social change. And it is through architecture that we can understand a lot of those changes. And I would also say it's through art that, through the representations of one's life, that we can also understand what those changes mean and how these kind of complex movements affect identities and livelihoods. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that come up.
All right. Wow, that was amazing, pretty mind-blowing. As an educator, I feel like I've definitely reflected on architecture in schools as well, and how they kind of, I feel like the architecture of schools today is, I remember reading about how they were initially built from like the Industrial Revolution and kind of like in factory, and even like the bell systems and everything. So you're saying how the architecture, like the policies change, everything changes, but the architecture kind of keeps the systems going, or the creativity kind of stifled in there.
Mm-hmm.
Resonated. So we're gonna take some questions now from both the chat and let's see what's going on Facebook Live. First question in the chat says, what role did trains have before cars, and when did that change? From Stephen Siebert.
Yeah. Well, trains come a lot earlier. And so you get trains in the 1880s going through Monterrey, going through the other side of Mexico. And then there's a big train line that did also connect Jalisco with the north. And I think the train connecting Jalisco in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, did, impact movement and mobility, some potential early movement and mobility. I haven't specifically studied how the trains in that early period may have been used for migration as opposed to cargo, because I don't think that most of those trains were passenger trains. But the cars, even though I showed you those cars in the 1920s being photographed in Michoacan, the cars don't really come en masse until later. You know, it's really a more recent phenomena that a lot of people who live in central Western states are able to drive the distance. And I mean, not recent, you know, it's more like after World War II that became something that was more heavily practiced. But I think it's a fascinating question. Transportation has such a huge influence on migration patterns. So, you know, you could do a whole study of just that, of just looking at trains, looking at cars, and the history of them with that question of how did that impact migration from different regions. Last thing I'll say is that we do see patterns of places that didn't have trains historically having the migration patterns happen later, right? Like Oaxaca or other places.
Let's see. Are there influences in architecture here in the US from the Mexican immigrants? Any here in Austin? It's kind of like the reverse happening.
Yeah. So my current project is on a Mexican stone called cantera, and it is on people who want to build here with, you know, the style and the material from their home state or homeland. And often, not only are they transporting the stone, but often they're having it sculpted and shaped in Mexico. And so they're transporting these kind of pieces already finished that are assembled here to create more often kind of Spanish colonial style architectures, but different things. So yeah, absolutely. There are ways that we are seeing the architecture of Mexico coming north as well.
Amalia Morin says, superb presentation. M. Armstrong says, will there be a recording available? I'd love to share with a friend. This is being broadcasted on Facebook Live as well, and it's going to be available as a post there. But we'll also send it out as we'll also upload it to YouTube in like a week or so. And our past lectures are available on YouTube as well. Jose Luis Cano says, have you noticed any differences between fences surrounding houses from people that work in the US and send money back to build homes in comparison to those that stay in Mexico the entire time?
Fences?
Yes.
Fences surrounding houses in the US? The fence in the US or the fence in Mexico?
So let's see, it says, any differences between fences surrounding houses from people that work in the US and send money back to build homes in comparison to those that stay in Mexico the entire time? So I guess
maybe fence in Mexico. Maybe that's what they mean, is that building a fence. I mean, the reason that's a really interesting question, and I don't know if I'm understanding it correctly, but fence building is something that is changing, both in the United States and in Mexico. And fence building is an indicator of many interesting things. So for example, there's a family in Los Angeles and they send money to Mexico, but they are also investing in their home in LA. And because they have had success with their Mexican restaurant business, they built like a kind of fancy house. And so they put a big new fence, but they put it in kind of a Spanish colonial style, you know, sort of, you don't really see fences like that so much in LA, where it's like a kind of big painted, brightly colored, stuccoed fence. In Mexico, that's a really good question, because the issue of these houses sometimes being abandoned, or not, if not abandoned, just sometimes sitting vacant and empty for long periods of time, because people will be working in the US. And so then maybe the house will sit empty for 10 months and then they'll go for the summer and spend, or they'll go for Christmas or December and spend a month there. And so things could get stolen, right? People are worried about burglaries and thefts or vandalism, especially if you're building something that's opulent in comparison to what might be next to it. I haven't seen in my research so far a lot of people dealing with that possibility by building fences in Mexico, but that is something that I would absolutely look for. Like, that's a great question in terms of, you know, is that something that is happening and what would it mean?
Another question. Are cars as much a status symbol as the architecture in Mexico? I'm speaking of the remittance section of your presentation. What is your opinion of the idea of standing out? And then he adds onto it saying, I'm wondering if the flamboyant style is viewed by other townspeople as positive.
Yeah, I think cars are a huge status symbol in Mexico as well. And partly just cars are a huge status symbol in the US. Cars are a huge status symbol. You know, like, you know, I have a 2002 beat up car, and I these days I drive on the freeway and I feel like I have a hatchback. I feel like I'm this tiny ant and I'm going to get squashed because everyone has these huge Fords with these big SUV, you know, tinted, and not only is that affecting people who come here and they see the way we are here with our cars, but in Mexico, I think the idea of acquiring one's first car, a lot of people who are leaving may not have been able to afford a car if they had not left. So they're you know, after very hard work, they're able to get a car, and they want that car to be nice. So, you know, it depends. I see another question coming up in the chat about a barrio aesthetic. And I think it depends on the age of the person. Like, if it's a young man who is coming to work here, who's like 20, 21, 25, then yeah, he wants like a bling bling car. You know, his car is going to be tinted windows. It's going to have shiny hubcaps, and he will go back down for Christmas, for December, for the holidays, and he will drive it around with like the music blasting slowly to have a bit of a parade, a bit of a performance. So the other part of the question, let's see if I can remember what he was asking. Is it a car? And then, the people in the neighborhood, the other people, how do they feel about the stature of the house? And I think that's a really great question. I do explore these topics more in my book. So if you are interested, my book is on Amazon. It's called, and it's not expensive. It's like a normal book price. Sometimes academic books are too expensive, but it's complex, that question, because I think some people who live in the town feel jealousy. I think some people who live in the town feel excitement, you know, by the changes. I think some people in the town, I mean, based on my conversations and being there, I think some people in the town, you know, see the success that some people are able to achieve and get motivated themselves. So I think it's a complex question. I think people have a lot of different responses to the architecture.
I agree. And I feel like, I mean, this is just a thought I had from the question as well. Like, I don't know if you've heard of troqueando culture, which is something that's kind of like blowing up on the internet. I think the internet is a tool now too, to kind of see like what your cousins abroad are doing with their trucks, and then like they try to fix their trucks up in Mexico the same way. And it's like there's a truck culture that's like very popular right now.
Yeah. I think I think it's like an art piece almost, you know, just like what's happening with the cars and with some of the clothing. It's pretty sophisticated. Yeah.
Let's see, I'll take a few last ones. Here we have one from Ben Gritsky. Regarding fences, the concept of gated communities is so controversial. Can you comment?
Yeah. In the places where I have been, there is not the scale of development where anything like a gated community has taken shape. But I have done a little bit of research, for example, in El Salvador, and in some other parts of the Northern Triangle, in Honduras and Guatemala. I have seen examples of like remittance gated communities where, you know, entire communities are being built that are gated and that have a kind of surveillance or a police station at the, you know, someone watch as security guard. And that is also due to the increased violence, the increased general violence in some of those places. But it's really difficult. It raises so many questions, you know, about how what does it mean that someone can have socioeconomic mobility at home, and then the social changes and the discomfort that might ignite because it might not be an equitable rising of the entire home, right? It might be just some able to do this and not others. What does it mean that people who come here perhaps don't feel like they are able or want to invest here? Maybe at first they don't feel that way, and so they send money back, and then over time they start investing here and building homes here. It just raises a lot of I think, questions about equity and justice in terms of where do we provide better lives for people that are safe? Where is that? And does everyone have the opportunity to make that happen and choose their futures? Or are people making choices that are within a lot of constrictions and constraints that result in these weird landscapes, if that makes any sense?
Definitely. And then you mentioned your book. Some people are interested in the title of it. Do you think we can have it so I could type it in the chat, or would you like to?
Yeah, I should probably just send a link. It's the Remittance Landscape. And let me even just, I can see if I can get a link on Amazon.
Definitely. Running out of time for questions, so I'll ask one last one. Is what about the plastic that covers the furniture and is not taken off? So,
what about it? Yeah, you know, it's interesting. It's well, I mean, in that one example I was telling you is like that was just trying to keep the dust from the furniture, since the people who live there are working in Napa Valley. Actually, they're vineyard workers and owners. Eventually they became owners. So it's kind of symbolic, isn't it? Right? To have those coverings. It's a bit sad. You kind of want those spaces to be lived in, and yet they're being protected and preserved. Yeah. So, well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm gonna let Dr. Vargas here close it out.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez, for that fascinating and unique lecture. I myself wanted to ask you about the truck aesthetic, La Troca. Many young people, many Mexicanos, Chicanos in South Texas prefer the truck over the car, and they really jazz them up more so than the car. But that would be another lecture. We now will close the program. Thank you all. And we invite all of you to hear our last scholar, Dr. David R. Maciel, on May the 1st, Saturday, 11 a.m. We'll speak on La Cultura Sigue, La Frontera, the border as reflected in the cinematic lens. And on that note, we bid you goodbye. Adios. Thank you very much, you all.